Yo, what's going on, guys? It's Houston Sports Talk back into the video today. And today, I'm going to be talking about my 53-man roster predictions for the Houston Texans. Let's get into it. I've talked about this before, but every week on game week until the Texans announce their 53 initial man roster, I'm going to be doing predictions before and after Texans preseason game. So, it was, I believe, Tuesday or Wednesday before last night's game where the Texans lost to the Bears 21-17, even though the Texans and the Bears did not finish the final 3 minutes of the third quarter or the entire fourth quarter. The Texans lose 21-17, though. I did a Texans, I did a Texans 53-man roster prediction video. And I announced I'm going to do this before and after every Texans preseason game. We're going to have 4 Texans preseason games. So I'm going to do it after and before the Pittsburgh Steelers game, as the Texans will play the Steelers next Friday. And then they'll have 2 games at NRG Stadium against the Rams and the Giants. I'll do it before and after that. So let's get into it. So I'm going to start off with, what the 53-man roster will be. Obviously going to go over the players that get cut, but I'm going position by position. So we're going to go from quarterback and go throughout the whole offense, and then we'll go to the defense, starting with the defensive line throughout the whole defense. Let's get into it. So at quarterback, obviously we know C.J. Stroud's making the roster. Obviously he didn't play last night, but of course he's making the roster. Davis Mills and Case Keenum are the 2 other quarterbacks I have making this roster. I want to keep everybody in mind when going over these predictions. I'm kind of basing it off what we saw last year. Not by the players we saw on the roster last year, but how many players. Like whether the Texans had 3 quarterbacks on their roster or it was 2. There was 3 on the roster, 53-man roster last year. So I think it's going to probably be that again. Doesn't mean that can change and the Texans potentially cut Tim Boyle and Case Keenum and just keep CJ and Davis on the roster? Sure, that could of course happen. But most likely, all 3 guys will be on the roster. Because if CJ Stroud, God forbid, were to get hurt and Davis Mills becomes a starter, there is no backup. And they do have the rule now where you can have a third quarterback, on the 53-man roster. Or, you can have a third quarterback active on game day, but he can only come in if the first 2 quarterbacks get injured. So the Texans most likely will have 3 quarterbacks on the roster again. So that means the only quarterback that gets cut on the roster is Tim Boyle. So as all the positions go on, I keep going. I'm kind of mimicking the way the Texans did it last year. And let's get to running backs and fullbacks. The Texans last year had 5 running backs and fullbacks on their roster last year. So here are the 5 guys that I have making the roster: Joe Mixon, Dameon Pierce, Andrew Beck, Cam Akers, Duran Gabolaway. That means the decisions that the Texans make, cutting running backs and fullbacks. That means Jawar Jordan, 205th overall pick, gets cut. J.J. Taylor, who looked pretty good yesterday in their preseason game, gets cut. Undrafted free agent British Brooks gets cut. And Troy Harrison gets cut. I don't want to see Jawar Jordan go. I don't want to see him get cut, but I think most likely he could be a guy who is a potential practice squad guy for the Texans. And he didn't look too great in his 3 carries, 5 rushing yards. Unfortunately, if the game went on, he would have had more of an opportunity, and he didn't get that opportunity with the Texans yesterday in the game. But with what I saw from Cam Akers yesterday, and what I saw from Duran Gabolaway, those are 2 guys that have to make the roster, if you ask me, just off of 1 preseason game. We'll see as the other preseason games go on, but those 2 guys looked sharp in the game yesterday, Duran Gabolaway and Cam Akers. Right now, I think they got a roster spot on this team, if you ask me. And, of course, you're not going to see Joe Mixon, Dameon Pierce, or Andrew Beck get cut. And Troy Harrison, the fullback, unfortunately goes as well. This is the hardest position to pick on the roster, and it's wide receivers. Last year the Texans had 6 wide receivers on the roster. I don't see that changing. I don't. And Of course, you're going to have Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell, Nico Collins, Noah Brown on the roster. Those are the 4 guarantees. You're not going to see either 4. You're not going to see one of those 4 guys get cut, of course. But then who are the last 2 guys? That's where it gets hard. And you decide between 4 guys and 2 guys make it. It's Robert Woods, it's Xavier Hutchinson, it's John Mechie, and it's Ben Skoranek. And Skoranek looked good yesterday. We didn't see Robert Woods. Xavier Hutchinson looked amazing, and John Mechie looked really bad. So, look, they wouldn't be playing Robert Woods yesterday if right now they thought he was fighting for a roster spot. Unless they get a trade offer for him, I think Robert Woods is making the roster. And I don't want to see John Mechie go, but with the way Xavier Hutchinson looked in yesterday's game, he had 3 receptions for 56 receiving yards, was doing some great things. I don't see him not making the roster with what we saw from him yesterday. It's not impossible that John Mechie could get signed to the practice squad, but if you're going to decide between Xavier Hutchinson and John Mechie, from what we saw from one preseason game, I would go with Xavier Hutchinson. But thank God there's not one preseason game. There's 4. So we'll see if John Mechie improves in the upcoming preseason games and what Xavier Hutchinson does. But if I had to pick 6 wide receivers on this roster right now, I'm going with Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell, Nico Collins, Noah Brown, Robert Woods, and Xavier Hutchinson. And then the guys to go are John Mechie, Ben Skoranek, Steven Sims, Johnny Johnson III, Quintez Cephas, and Jaden Yankee. And the last 3 guys right there that I just went over, Johnny Johnson III, Quintez Cephas, and Jaden Yankee, didn't get an opportunity to get some actual playing time in yesterday's preseason game due to the cancellation. So that's really tough. Let's get to the tight end position. I got the Texans having 3 tight ends on their roster: Dalton Schultz, Brevin Jordan, and Cade Stover, 123rd overall pick. So that means Dalton Keene and Tegan Quintoriano are the 2 tight ends that get cut. Quintoriano looked really good yesterday with 2 receptions for 21 receiving yards and 1 touchdown. Great. But he got injured. Of course he did. He got injured as he scored the touchdown and was carted off. Injuries have been a consistent problem for Tegan Quintoriano. And if they're going to have 3 tight ends on the roster, I don't see him being one of them. And looking at the first drive and what he did, he's making me think, okay, maybe he can make the Texans think, all right, we'll have 4 tight ends on the roster, but it's just injuries and injuries with him. And Dalton Keene is a guy I think that could potentially get picked up to the practice squad. Now let's get to the offensive line. This is a position where I think you'll see 8 offensive linemen make the roster. That's exactly what we saw last year. And here are the 8 guys I have making the roster: Lermy Tunsil, Kenyon Green, Juice Scruggs, Shaq Mason, Titus Howard, Blake Fisher, Kendrick Green, and Jarrett Patterson. That means the offensive linemen to get cut for the Texans are Nick Broker, Dieter Iselin, Ladorius Henderson, the 249th overall pick, Chris Reed, Charlie Heck, which is a tough roster cut. He's been with the Texans for quite a while now, David Sharp, Jalen Thomas, and Killian Zier. Now, with the offensive line finished, we will get to the defense, the defensive line. Texans had 9 defensive linemen to make the roster last year. So let's go over the 9 defensive linemen that I have making the roster: Will Anderson Jr., Daniil Hunter, Foley, Fudukasi, Mario Edwards Jr., Derek Barnett, Kurt Heinisch, Dylan Horton, Jerry Hughes, and Khalil Davis. With that being said, the following defensive linemen get cut from the roster. You would see Solomon Byrd, 238th overall pick, Malik Fisher, 247th overall pick, Ali Gay, McTelvin Agim, Marcus Harris, and Tim Settle get cut. And a lot of those guys right there that I just mentioned didn't get a lot of playing time due to the cancellation. Mainly McTelvin Agim and Marcus Harris are the 2 guys. And Ali Gay did get some playing time, but McTelvin and Marcus Harris didn't get a lot of playing time due to the game being canceled. Now let's go over the rest of the defense with the linebackers. The linebackers I make in the roster: Azeez Al-Shahir, Christian Harris, Henry To'o, Jake Hansen, Novelli Hewitt, Jamal Hill. And the linebackers that get cut from the roster with that is Tariq Barnes, Delshawn Phillips, Jacob Phillips, Max Tooley. So there would be 4 linebackers cut. I didn't see anything too special from any of those 4 guys right there last night. Now let's get to the secondary, the final position for the Texans. So cornerbacks and safeties and nickels for the Texans. And here are the 10 guys in the secondary I have making the Texans 53-man roster. At the cornerback position, Derek Stingley Jr., Kamari Lassiter, the 42nd overall pick, C.J. Henderson, and Jeff Okudah. Then the safeties, Jalen Petrie, Jimmy Ward, Kalen Bullock, 78th overall pick, and Eric Murray. And then your 2 nickels, Desmond King II and Miles Bryant. And then to wrap it up with the cuts for the secondary, the guys that would get cut in the secondary, Mike Ford, Chris Boyd, Troy Pride Jr., D'Angelo Ross, Brendan Hill, Lonnie Johnson, and MJ Stewart. And then final part, the 3 guys that make the roster on the special teams, Kaimi Fairbairn, Tommy Townsend, the punter, and John Weeks, the long snapper. So let me know your thoughts on my 53-man roster prediction for the Houston Texans. This is early. This is so early. There's still 3 preseason games left, so of course this can change. There are already some changes from last time before the matchup. I didn't have Xavier Hutchinson making the roster before last night's game. I did not have Cam Akers making the roster before last night's game. So those were 2 guys that impressed me last night. So I have them making the roster. But of course that can change before or after next week's game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. That's the video. Hope you guys enjoyed, and peace out.